Thank you so much, Yuli. I hope everyone can hear me clearly. If you can't, please type in the chat window so that I know that you cannot hear me. Um, I am so happy to be doing this Melton share. We were going to do it in December, but there were some technical difficulties with the webinar format. Just internet and whatnot. So I'm glad it's finally happening. I think, as Yuli mentioned, some of you know who I am and have met me in person. We have hung out, we have talked, we have laughed. But for many of you, I might be completely brand new. I worked at the Melton Foundation for a few years until 2014. I used to do all the marketing, branding, communications, and that's when I worked closely with Yuli and Lars and Patti, Winthrop, Micah. And I was fortunate to be in Bangalore and in Germany for two GCCs. Here's a little bit about myself as far as my connection with the Melton Foundation. But I also have been working in marketing communications for many years, for about 15 years, and I still do that. I have a company called Take Two Services, and we do fundraising and marketing communications for nonprofits. In the last couple of years, I've focused a lot on storytelling. I'm also a writer. And so stories are kind of what keep me going every day. And so that was part of the reason why I was asked to do a session on storytelling. And here I'm really going to be focusing more on, how you can sort of define and identify stories from your projects and from your work. So let me get into what we'll actually be covering today. And as Yuli said, please type in any questions in the chat window, and I'll answer them at the end unless they're really urgent and need to be addressed right away. It's nice to see some familiar faces or familiar names in the chat over here. So thank you all for joining. So what we're covering today is, first of all, why do stories matter even? Then we're going to talk about the core elements of most stories, pretty much every story, I would say, though with some exceptions, and we'll get into that. Then I'm going to identify story moments and talk about how you can identify them from your projects and from your work. And then we're going to just quickly review some examples of story formats, various types of story formats. And then finally, we have time for Q&A. So we've got quite a bit to cover. Why waste a second? So let me go ahead. And here I would like to ask you all to, try and type into the chat window very briefly your questions or your answers to the question, why do you think stories matter? If you can type into the chat window, that would be great. So why do stories matter from your point of view? Just any quick responses to that. So Ashi says to gain perspectives. Great. Others, don't be shy. No wrong answers, actually. Sharing is caring from Carla. Paints a picture that numbers don't. Absolutely. Says Carrie. Makes it more engaging, says Drew. Raimundo says to empathize. Felicitas says to create an emotional connection. The most impactful way to empathize, gain empathy, transmits emotions from Caro. Great. These are all excellent reasons and some of the reasons why we're focusing so much on stories. So here are some of the reasons. Anna posted, because stories can create reality and actually become history. Excellent. So let's talk about some of these very quickly. So one of the main reasons people really have started to um, dwell on using stories or focus on using stories so much is because stories make it possible for us to remember things. They can illustrate sometimes very big issues, sometimes small issues, questions, and make complex issues very more digestible, and therefore more memorable. It's what we connect with. Individuals we connect with in a story help us remember. They have the sticky quality. And then, as somebody said, I think it was, let me see, Carrie said, paints a picture that numbers don't, and to empathize, to create an emotional connection. So to put a human face to complex issues. So as I mentioned, if we're talking about something like here in the States right now, immigration is a very hot button issue, and people are constantly talking about, the millions of people who would be deported, et cetera, et cetera. But nothing, those numbers, while convincing and important, don't really tell us what the immigration journey or history of a person might be, and that a story can do through the human element. They help people to establish an emotional connection. Many people have said that. Caro said it, Felicitas said it, etc. And that's absolutely true. I mean, that's why stories have been around for as long as they have. In fact, storytelling is kind of an essential unit of how we communicate. If you think about your day and you go home and you are maybe, talking to a friend or a family member, and they ask you, how was your day? And you're like, okay, good, fine. And they're like, well, what happened? And then you start to tell what happened is when you're telling a story. Most often it's like, well, hey, you won't believe what happened. I was in the subway and then this guy did this weird thing. And then all of the people got mad and then we all had to leave the subway. And the train stopped and I was late for work. And that's a very simple anecdote of how we communicate every single day. And that is storytelling in its most basic form. And then finally, we have this point: stories shape how we see ourselves and the world and how the world sees us, which kind of relates to Anna's point about stories can create reality and actually become history. And I actually borrowed this point from this guy, famous guy, called Shekhar Kapur. He is a filmmaker and kind of like a person, an intellectual in India. He's pretty famous. And I couldn't share the video. I mean, you can't watch it right now. And I didn't send the link around because it's a whole TED Talk. But at the core of this TED Talk, the TED Talk is called "We Are the Stories We Tell Ourselves." He basically says that, the stories we tell ourselves are the stories that define the potentialities of our existence. We are the stories that we tell ourselves. And I think the more important, the couple of things that I really want to point out is what he says. A story is a relationship that you develop between who you are or who you potentially are and the infinite world. And that's our mythology. So stories define who we are in the world. And we also help us make sense of who we are and our place in the world, and how we one of the things about stories that's pretty inspiring is that they're aspirational usually, and that helps us get a sense not just of who we are now but who we want to be. And he says if we do not create stories, we probably go mad. I don't know, I'm not sure, but that's what I've done all the time. And I think there's, I'm trying to imagine a culture where there is no storytelling, and I simply cannot imagine it. It's such a basic part of everyday culture, of human culture. Stories do define what we understand about places and people. There's been a lot of mythology in the West about African countries, mythology around war, around poverty. These are all stories that we've heard in the news, which have defined a Western perspective or some Western perspective around countries in Africa, and people are now combating them. I'm sure some of you have seen that TED Talk, The Danger of a Single Story by Chimamanda Adichie, which is a brilliant TED Talk, and the need for multiple stories. But that's a whole other webinar. Right now, I want to just talk a little bit about the basic elements of pretty much every story and how you can identify them. So I'm going to start with the most basic type of story, which is, a fairy tale. And I'm going to read the story out to you, which you already know and have heard probably your entire life. But I'm doing it with a particular reason. And I would like you to just pay attention to the plot twists that happen in this fairy tale. So once upon a time, a young girl named Cinderella lived a happy life with her parents. But her mother dies, and soon after, her father marries a woman with two other daughters. Then he dies, and the stepmother becomes cruel to Cinderella, turning her into a servant. Her stepsisters too mock and torture her. Cinderella's life is miserable. Meanwhile, in the same kingdom, the king is looking for a suitable girl to marry his son. He invites all the unmarried women to a ball. Cinderella wants to go to the ball, and her mother says she can only go if she finishes all her chores. Cinderella works hard and finishes everything in time, but she has nothing to wear. She starts to cry, and her tears produce her fairy godmother. Her fairy godmother gives her clothes and shoes, but warns her that she must return home by midnight, which is when the magic fades. At the ball, Cinderella and the prince meet and dance and fall in love. Just before the stroke of midnight, Cinderella remembers her grandmother's warning and rushes from the ball. But she leaves behind one glass slipper. She thinks she will never see the prince again. But the prince begins his search for the beautiful girl he danced with, sending his footman with the glass slipper that was left behind. The girl whose foot fits the slipper must be the one. At Cinderella's house, the stepsisters try hard to squeeze. Oops, excuse me. I'm sorry. I think this went out of the. Here we go. At Cinderella's house, the stepsisters try hard to squeeze their feet into the glass slipper, but they cannot. Just before the footman leaves, he asks if there is any other maiden in the house. Cinderella then appears. She tries on the glass slipper. It fits. The prince recognizes her, and they marry and live happily ever after. So this is, the story that you've heard over and over and over again. So let's kind of break it down into some of the core elements of what makes this a story. So the first and primary element of any story is a central character. Sometimes you can have multiple characters, but you must have some particular individual or set of individuals with whom we associate, with who pushes the story forward. This is Cinderella's story at the end of the day. And the reason we have a central character is because we want to follow one person's or maybe a couple of people's or a group's journey, but we want to have someone with whom we see kind of a glimmer of ourselves, someone whom we associate with, and that is Cinderella in this case. Another part of every story is to have some kind of principal obstacle. So in this case, the obstacle is that the stepmother becomes cruel to Cinderella and tortures her, turns her into a servant. This whole section, this first paragraph, is explaining to us the basic situation that is going on with Cinderella, establishing her life and identifying for us the main obstacle. So you want a central character who is facing some kind of obstacle. Then we move into the next paragraph. Meanwhile, in the same kingdom, where we get, the basic setting, and we'll talk about that more. And the king is looking for a suitable girl, so we have more information. He invites all the unmarried women to a ball. There's something else happening over here. Now we have what's really important. Cinderella wants to go to the ball, and her grandmother says she can only go if she finishes all her chores. What happens with this line, Cinderella wants to go to the ball, is that we have a desire from the character manifested. And this is really important because in the previous, up to now, we have an implicit desire from Cinderella. It's never stated, but we can assume that she wants to not be unhappy, and she does not want to be tortured, and she does not want to be in the situation that she is. But now with this ball, we have a very specific, concrete desire. So in many of these cases that you might be dealing with, projects that you're dealing with, you kind of have a general situation where, let's say, literacy is low, and your project is helping to teach young people, kids, how to read. So that's the general situation, but you want to have a specific desire. So let's say you're doing this literacy project in Manuko. I'm just making this up, and you have you know a problem in the area where there aren't enough resources, and people don't have access to education, and so literacy is really important. But then you want to have a character with a specific desire. So not only do they want to learn how to read and write, but they want to learn how to read and write in order to maybe leave, maybe find a job, maybe it's their path to happiness, maybe they've always loved reading, whatever the reason is, you want them to have a specific desire. And then let's move on to the question, which probably most of you are familiar with, which is a plot. You need to have something happen. And these are the basic elements in a plot. You have an obstacle. So the obstacle here with Cinderella is Cinderella wants to go to the ball. That's her desire. The obstacle is her stepmother saying she can only go if she finishes her chores. So Cinderella has an obstacle she has to overcome, and she takes an action. Cinderella works really hard and finishes everything in time. Finishes everything in time gives us a resolution. But then in this basic story, we have, but she has nothing to wear. So we have another obstacle here, or a conflict here. And then what happens? She starts to cry, action 2. Her tears produce her fairy godmother, a resolution. The fairy godmother gives her clothes and shoes, but warns her that she must return by midnight, where we have a third conflict. So I'm using obstacle and conflict interchangeably, but really the obstacle is what comes in the way of the desire, the character reaching her or achieving her desire, achieving her goal. And the obstacles are usually manifested in terms of some kind of conflict. So you don't have to worry too much about the terminology, but just know that you have to have something that the main character is trying to overcome. They must take an action, and they must usually should reach some kind of positive resolution. I'm not going to say, I want to just stop in here and say that, I'm talking about basic kind of tenets of a story, and just know that they don't apply universally. You have stories, of course, that don't have these neat endings, that don't have things resolved, that don't have action. And we'll be looking at some of those as well. But these are kind of the elements that you need in a story. I want to talk about the last few elements that are really important. So setting is really important. You need to know where this is happening, the location, and in this particular story, it's set in it's a fairy tale. It's set in an imaginary world, but we have over here in the same kingdom. The first section, this could be anywhere, right? Once upon a time, a young girl named Cinderella lived a happy life with her father, etc., etc. We don't have a real idea of where this is taking place. But the next paragraph, meanwhile, in the same kingdom, the king is looking for a suitable girl to marry his son. So now we know that we're set in a world where there are kings and queens. That might be a make-believe world. It might be a real world, but that's the setting of it. And that can be really important sometimes, though not always, because what we can notice with setting is that if a story has enough universality, it really doesn't matter. A character struggle is universal. It doesn't matter if they're in Ghana, if they're in Chile, if they're in New York, wherever, because the actual character story is so compelling. At the same time, a situation that might be a difficult obstacle for somebody in New York may not really be applicable for somebody in Ashesi, for example, or for somebody in Bangalore. So maybe something in New York that would be very specific there would be, okay, problems with the subways. Now, the universal problem of having to get to a job and public transportation not running on time, everybody gets that. But the specific nature of the subway not showing up is really tailored to the situation in New York, and that's where setting is really important. The last thing I want to talk about is time and change over time specifically. This is a really crucial element. I think it's really hard to, you have stories that where, you don't really have a time frame. Absolutely you do. But I think it really helps. You need to establish when a story is taking place right in the beginning. So here it is, once upon a time, meaning, once at some point in time without anything specific. But then we have something happening which indicates to us that time is passing but not much is changing, which is this particular line: Cinderella's life is miserable. The use of that life is miserable connotes that this is going on for a while. This is the passage of time. It's continuing to be that way. Meanwhile is another example. This is going on and on. But then we come to one day, and again, we have a particular moment in time. We're zoomed into that particular day. And then finally, when we come to the end, we have they soon marry and live happily ever after. There's the end of time. Time has, the story has ended, and we have basically an arc from the beginning until the end with a clear middle in there. One thing that's really interesting that's happening in the Cinderella story, and I think is quite important, is that when we have one day he invites all the unmarried women to a ball, we have the introduction of a clock. The clock is the ball, the time period that it goes. So the main heart of the story is really Cinderella getting to the ball with the help of her fairy godmother, dancing with the prince, leaving her glass slipper behind, coming back home and thinking she's never going to see the prince again. So that's the main event. And we have, because it's defined by this event of a ball, there's a clock in place. Going to the ball, being at the ball, coming back from the ball. So that's something that's, really important to do. Not that you have to have an event taking place within the main structure of the story, but that you need to have some kind of concrete clock from beginning, middle, end. I hope this is clear. It can be a little confusing, but we can talk about it in the Q&A. So there we have, the basic elements of a story. And I'm just going to recap them. So we first need a character preferably who has a desire for something to change, a motivation, a strong motivation. We have a conflict or an obstacle, and that could be take any number of shapes. It could be a concrete obstacle, the bus is not running, or it could be Cinderella's stepmother who imposes an obstacle, or it could be something even within the character's own mind where they think that they're not capable of achieving something. There's an inherent conflict over there. Then we have, this is really important and where a lot of stories fail. We need the character to take some action, to actually do something in order to change their circumstances. And then, of course, the resolution we're very familiar with. That's not always necessary, but that's usually the point of the story. We need setting, where things are happening. And we need change over time. And more specifically, we need, what is the clock of the story to identify when is the story taking place, over what period of time, what central event. Is it a day long? Is it an hour long? Is it an evening long? Is it a year long? Is it the whole lifetime of a story? And then finally, how does the passage of time affect the character? What happens over this period of time, throughout that day, throughout that hour? What is taking place that has significance, that has consequences for the character and the story? So that's really important, because if you have a story that's taking place over the duration of a day, you might have so many events happen and so many things happen during a day. Not all of them are significant. So it's identifying the most significant aspects. And the way to identify the most significant aspects is not just the dramatic value of them, but also how it affects the character or the story outcome. So those are the basic elements of a story that pretty much every single story has. So I want to pause now and ask if people have any questions about this until this point. I'm going to just hang on for a second in case people are typing. Okay, seems like there are no questions yet. Okay, so then I'm going to move on to how we can identify story elements from our everyday lives, from the projects that we're working on. Great, thank you, Verena, saying all clear until now. So let's move into how we can identify these story elements. I want to start with a very basic example from personal life, like a personal story. And these are the types of stories that are most common to us, where we are telling our own stories of something that happened to us. So I went to the supermarket. Someone stole my wallet. I would call my family for help, I decided, but my phone was gone too. The store manager called the police. I explained the situation to the police and left my watch as a guarantee. The police called me a cab and I went home. Now, here we have a very basic story where we have a dramatic going to the supermarket. So we have a setting, we have a character. Implied in it is that they went shopping. Someone stole my wallet. Obstacle, something's happened. I would call my family for help, I decided. But my phone was gone too. Here we have, so we have the character attempting to take an action, but there's a new obstacle. His phone is also gone. And then we have the story, and then we have, but my phone was gone too. So we have this new obstacle, and then we have the store manager calls the police. Yet another obstacle, yet another conflict. And then I explained the situation to the police and left my watch as a guarantee. And here we have, again, the character taking some action and then the resolution. Police called me a cab and I went home. Now, this is a very basic story that we would tell about ourselves, right? Like this is something that would happen. But there are some really important elements missing from the story. And I'm going to talk about, I'm just going to share what actually, another way to tell this story with some additional information and see how that changes what we understand. So I went to the supermarket. Someone stole my wallet. I tried to call my family for help, okay? But my phone was gone too. I pleaded with the store manager to let me make a call. Instead, the store manager calls the police. When the police arrived, I explained that my wallet had been stolen and asked them to look up my identity. And I left my watch as a guarantee with the store manager. The police called me a cab and I went home. I vowed never to return to that store, nor to keep all my credit and ID cards in one place. And so here, the difference, as you can see, is we have a change in the character at the end. In the previous one, we did have a change in the character because we did have a change in that the situation was resolved. The person was no longer at the store, stuck without a wallet, without a phone, the police comes, they take him or her home, and that's done. But here we have a resolution from the point of view of the character who decides not to return to that store and not to keep all their ID cards in one place. That is critical. This change in the character, change that impacts the story. That's what I'm talking about, change over time. The other thing that's important in this story is that in this example, in the second example, the character actually tries to do several things. I tried to call my family for help, but my phone was gone too, so new obstacle. I pleaded with the store manager to let me make a call. When the police arrived, I explained that my wallet was missing and asked them to look at my identity. I left my watch as a guarantee and I went home. I vowed never to return to that store. So here's a good way when you're writing stories or thinking about stories is to look at your verbs. This is a grammatical thing, but it's actually really important. Look at the verbs and see what actions. So verbs are the action words, right? We all know that. The words where we use ing, walking, talking, listening, etc. But look at your stories and look at what actions the character is doing. So here we have went to the supermarket, tried to call, pleaded the store manager, explained to the police, asked them to look up my ID, left my watch, went home, vowed never to return to the store. So we have the character taking specific actions. If you have a passive character to whom things are just happening, it's a very different type of story. You can have a story, but it's not really a compelling story because the thing is, we were all rooting for this character. Even if we hate the character, have you ever been in those situations when you're watching TV and you like really hate the character, but they're still doing something and you're still rooting for them, even if you don't want them to win? So that's where we are with, personal stories. I want to talk about project stories because I know that many of you are working on projects and probably are having some challenges in identifying stories about your projects or from your projects. So let's talk about, I'm just gonna read this very, very short quote unquote story. It's not really a story, I don't think, but I'm going to read it out anyway. So Art for All is a project that provides art and music classes for 400 children in 20 Philadelphia elementary schools that currently offer none at all. Since its inception in 2001, children in low-income communities with no access to arts education have been able to receive music, drawing, and other creative classes, which helps them stay in school and improve their chances of completing high school. So this is a very basic description about this project. And I've made this up, but I wrote this because I think this might be where many of you have descriptions about the projects that you are working on. I'm sure you have more complex projects. You're doing very interesting things and actually have stories from those projects. But a lot of times, we have descriptions that identify the problem. So we have a problem over here that these 20 schools offer no art and music lessons. And your project, Art for All, is helping to fill its gap. And it shows us also, or tells us what the outcome is. That kids in these communities who have not had any access to arts education now have music, drawing, and other creative classes. And it helps the kids stay in school, which also improves their chances of completing high school, finishing their education, getting a job. So there is implied in it, very clear outcome for what could happen and why this project is valuable. But what it of course does not have, which let me show you now, an example of how a story about this project could be told. Lillian was 12 years old and hated school. She often missed classes and had trouble with her grades. But in 2001, when Lily was in 5th grade, her school decided to participate in the Art for All program. Lily had never before had art or music classes in school. But she loved to sing. A teacher made Lily try out for the Art for All program. 3 years later, Lily auditioned for a citywide children's choir and she made the cut. Today, Lily has started a choir in her own high school. Thanks to Art for All, an organization that brings arts and music lessons to schools in Philadelphia, Lily discovered her love for music and for school. In the 6 years since she started singing, she's never missed a day of school. So at this point, usually I would like to ask you to identify the elements, but since that's hard to do when we're doing a webinar, I'm going to go ahead and identify them for you. But please, alongside my talking, just make notes for yourself. So we have central character, Lily Ann, right? We have an obstacle. It's slightly cut off over here, but she's had trouble with her grades. She often missed class and had trouble with her grades. So that's the big obstacle. That's the big conflict over there. Then we have a second one, or a second conflict, which is Lily had never before. So the Art for All program is introduced, potential resolution, but Lily has never before had art or music lessons in school. A teacher makes Lily try out for the Art for All program. We have an action coming in here. That's the first action. It's not an action that Lily takes. It's something that someone makes her do. So she takes the action of trying out, but it's not a voluntary action. Someone makes her do this, her teacher. And then we have the next action, which is Lily starts a choir of her own in her high school, right? And then that leads to a resolution. Lily discovers her love for music and for school. And then finally, we have change over time. In the 6 years since she started singing, she's never missed a day of school. Now, of course, we have, so these are the basic elements. We have the character, we have a plot, we have time, we have the setting. It's in Philadelphia, it's in a school. And this is, compared to the previous example, probably a more compelling story, because we have a central character who we can see taking action and seeing change over time. What's missing in this story, to some extent, is a motivation, because we don't really see Lily wanting to do this. We only have a hint that she loves to sing and that she's having trouble with schools. And this can often be a stumbling block for a lot of the stories around projects, because we don't have a clear motivation, or we don't have a clear action. A lot of times you'll end up with a story where you don't have a clear resolution. And that actually is the least of your problems. Without having a clear resolution, it's sometimes, you especially if you're talking about something like, say, climate change, you're not going to have a resolution on it. It's not happened yet. It's not happening, right? But you can still have change over time, change in thoughts, change in policies, change in behavior, and that's really what matters. I hope this is clear to everybody. I want to move on to talking about some other project stories. And here's actually a video that I had asked people to watch in advance. So if you could just in the chat window tell me if you've seen this video or not. And it's fine if you haven't. I just need to know so I can decide how much to explain it. Could you let me know if you've watched it? Okay, so some of you have seen it, a few have not, and that's okay. I basically wanted to talk to you about this. Maria says, thank God. Yes, not everybody watched it. It's fine. I figured that would happen. So I really encourage you all to watch this video when you get off, because it's only 1 minute long, and it's pretty amazing that they managed to pack in all this information in 1 minute. And that's they start out with the story. So those of you who watched it, it's about this guy, Jalak Bahadur Tamang, who is a shepherd, and he goes to this mountaintop library, um, where which was opened and recently, and he borrows books. And now, as a result of the library being there, a lot of other shepherds, including older men and another young girl, who is another character, is introduced, and they talk about the story talks about the difference this library has made in their lives, right? Now, in this particular, so a couple of things I want to point out. With this particular story, it is focusing on an individual, Chalak Bahadur, and later on some other people. And it is talking about his journey, his overcoming the obstacle of not having books to read, and probably not even knowing that he could read these books, and learning about the world. But it is told by somebody else. So this is not a first person story, right? It's not Jhalak Bahadur telling his own story. And that's important to keep in mind, because just like with Lily Ann's story, we're going to often, you're not going to be having the person tell their own story. You're going to be telling their story for them. So you have to think about how you're going to present that story. And in this Mountaintop Library story, it's not very clear what the obstacles are, nor what Jalak Bahadur's motivation is. I'm not sure if people found a particular motivation, but if you did, please share it in the chat window, because it's not completely clear. It's still a compelling story, though, because it puts the human face of Jhalak Bahadur onto this problem, as well as it describes for us this project about libraries in this remote area, and the impact that they can have in people's lives through the story of particular people, rather than just kind of a description of these mountaintop library projects, right? So it does have compelling elements, but not all of them. I want to move now to this slide. I don't know if people watched this video. Did everyone get a chance to see this video, or some of you, the Bell Bajao Bank Clerk video? Okay, great. So quite a few have seen this. And in this particular story, it's a very explicit conflict, an obstacle, right? There's this older man, his neighbor is beating his wife, and he hears them, and then he takes action. So in this story, we have a clear obstacle, we have a clear action that the character takes, and we have a resolution. The guy is interrupted from continuing to harass his wife, right? What we don't have is, we don't know if this is going to lead to long-term change. It's implied, because at the end, this guy looks at the old man and he's like, oh, wait a minute. My neighbor, this older man, can hear me. I probably shouldn't. And he knows it's not the right thing to do, so maybe I shouldn't continue this behavior. It's implied, perhaps, that he would stop his behavior, but at least we know that there's an interruption of the behavior. The cool thing about this story is that when the story begins, when the video begins, the old man is just returning home from work or wherever he's been out. He doesn't have a motivation except perhaps to just get home. But when he overhears his neighbor beating his wife, and he hears, the wife responding and crying for help, a motivation develops within him. Until that point, he is just another character. And so you can have, the elements of conflict, of setting, etc., come in at different points. You don't need to have it all right from the beginning. You also don't need to state it right from the beginning, or even anywhere in the story. A lot about what makes stories compelling is that you don't have, for instance, in the Cinderella story, we don't have anywhere Cinderella is unhappy and is dying to leave her stepmother and have a new life. It's not stated, it's implied, right? And here too, we have the implied information, which is that the old man does not think this is the right thing to do. He thinks it's the wrong thing. And therefore, we have him deciding to do something about it. So these are things that are implied in there. So how do you go about identifying these story moments? So from your projects, what I'd like you to do now is just take 2 or 3 minutes and think about the project that you're working on, or something that you've been thinking about telling a story around. And maybe it's a project that you're working on, maybe it's something from work, maybe it's your own personal life, like maybe it's your journey with the Melton Foundation. But just take a moment and think about a character, a person that you know, an individual, either from your own life or from your project, or maybe it's you yourself, and what their motivation might be. And just note it. Okay, so hopefully you all have identified a motivation, a character, and their motivation. And now I want you to think back and think about a particular event. Maybe I don't mean event in as something that you attend, but a particular situation, something that happened once, and identify what the conflict was, what the obstacle was in that event or in that occasion. And then I want you to think about what kind of action the character took. Maybe it was you. What did you do? And just jot down like very short bullet points. And then think about what the resolution was from that action. Did it solve the conflict or not? So Yuli has a great point. Life writes the best stories. So in case if you're having problems imagining something, just think about the last time you were in a conflict and what did you do to resolve the problem. Okay, good. So this is the seed of what can be a story. Now you have to think about, whether this resulted in change over time, in terms of yourself, if you're the character or whoever the character is, and whether it has enough drama, enough kind of compelling action to make it an interesting story. What is the context for the story? How does it matter in terms of the project that you're trying to work on, or whatever point you're trying to make with the story? Those are things that you have to think about and flesh out. I want to invite people to, in the chat window, or if you would like to talk, to just share anybody who may have shared, who may have identified either a character or an event from this particular example or process. Did anybody discover or identify a character or an event or an occasion that can be the seed of a story. Okay, I think everyone's feeling like shy or haven't been able to do this, but I hope that you can on your own time and use this as a starting point to really identify a story or two that you can tell about your project or about your personal life or about your time with the MF or whatever you're interested in talking about. As an example of a good story that I found on the Melton Foundation website, has everyone seen this blog? It's called Muscles and Equality, a Chilean Village's Specialties. And over here, you don't have one character, you have four. And it talks about these four women who have who started this kind of restaurant in this fishing village, and how they not only have become successful as restaurant owners, but they've also changed the attitude of the village, and especially of the men with regards to women. It's really worth looking at because it pretty much follows or has all of the elements. So if you're looking for a concrete example about a project or an event from the MF, this is a good one to look at. So you can find this on the MF blog. I'm not going to go to it because you can read it on your own time. But I want to talk about, sort of the range of stories that are possible before we get into Q&A. Just, we've been talking about, we've seen a bunch of videos. Here we have a blog which has a story, but there are lots of different types of stories, and I just want to share a few examples of some story formats that you can take a look at. So these are some examples, and this is a good example of how much you can tell with one story with the shortest amount of space. So supposedly the story was written by Ernest Hemingway when he was young, and his friend said he could, he said he could write a complete story in only 6 words, and his friend said, no, that's impossible, and people bet against him, and then he wrote this story down on a napkin, and everyone said he'd won the bet. But I don't know, that's just pure mythology. So this is the story. So, for sale, baby shoes never worn. And of course, we have here the element of for sale on its own doesn't mean anything. Baby shoes, now we know what's for sale. Never worn implies that the baby either died or was not born or something terrible happened to it. So we have an entire story encapsulated in 6 words, and we don't have a central character, we don't have a time, we don't have a setting, we just have the basics. And yet it still has the elements of a compelling story because we have an implied character, that the person who is selling the shoes is the character. What happened is we don't know. We don't know what happened to the baby, but we do know that we have that something terrible must have happened if the shoes were never worn. That we know, what can we infer about this character? That they bought shoes probably because they were going to have a baby. Something terrible happened to the baby. Now they're having to sell the shoes, right? So this is an example, a kind of short example of like a 6-word story. But there are lots of other examples of stories, and I'm just going to share with you some of them. I'm going to see if I can show you okay, you should all be able to see my browser now. So here, this is the story on for the MF, and then we have, this is an example of before we go there. Being a Girl Amongst the Boys is a video that I shared with you that I asked you to watch. This is a great example of a first-person story told by the main character themselves. And if you watch this, if you watch the story, you'll see that there's repeated conflicts and repeated obstacles that come up. Then I want to move to, but this is a video, and you can see it's really a lot of photographs with some video and narration. And the script is really, really important. This is something I want to emphasize. You have to write out your stories, even if you're just using video, even if you're just using photographs, even if it's heavy with music, you need some kind of written text or spoken text to frame the story. Here is an example of, I don't know how many of you are familiar with The Moth. If you're not, you should definitely check it out. It's online and on radio stations. You can have an app. They have an app, but it's all first-person stories told by real people, and they. This is just one example. You can just browse around and there are like lots of examples. They're usually pretty short, like under 10 minutes. Some are like very, very short, 3-4 minutes. And it's people recounting something that happened to them. And it really follows the same narrative arc pretty much. Okay. Here is a slideshow, and I just wanted to show you, like, you can have, great pictures with a little bit of text, and that's also a compelling story. And you can see you still need text for, in order to tell the story. Then I want to move to Twitter. I don't know how many of you are on Twitter, but here are some examples of people who've submitted their Twitter short stories, and it's only 140 characters, so it's a single tweet. And here are some examples: deep breath of cold air, hold it, anticipate, push off, blades crisp on ice, find the moment, shoot, wait, hope, pray, score. Okay, browse around. This is a way also of telling stories. Those of you who are on Instagram, you should be able to see Instagram has like these short stories now that you can do. You can share, you can make up little, or you can shoot little stories, videos and photographs, and create stories with them. So here you have the kitty who's just there, and that's just a photograph, and then you add like the mouse and the eyes, and you have a story created through it. Story. Yes.
Sorry for interrupting you. We currently cannot see your screen. Somehow it
disappeared.
Yes.
Oh, thank you.
We saw the Twitter, but when you change to the next one, to the kitty, now we can see it.
Okay, great. So sorry about that if you couldn't see it, but here again you can see the little the cute little cat. Just a photograph, and then you have like these added on things with the these ice shooting stars or whatever, blazers, and the little mouse. The mouse has been added on, and you can create a story from it. These are just like little examples to show you that there are many creative ways you can tell stories in a very short amount of time in using many different formats. So don't feel like you have to have like this beautiful video shot. It doesn't have to be elaborate. It can be very simple. And then most of you might be familiar with the Storyfy. I hope you are. But basically, this is where you can capture a whole set of tweets or a set of people's reactions to something happening and create a story out of it. I encourage you, I don't want to spend too much time on these because you can look at them on your own time. I'll be sharing this PowerPoint with you as a PDF, and you'll be able to see all of these different examples. Can you just tell me, Yuli, what you guys can see right now? Are you able to see my PowerPoint?
No, we are still in the story thing.
Okay.
Now we can't see anything.
That's not good. Oh. Okay. Share screen. Here we go.
Now we're in again.
Okay, so this is the moth. This is the Twitter, Instagram, and now finally Q&A. So I think there were some questions posted over here, right?
Yeah, there was one question from Pooja. How do you tell the story with an ongoing conflict or an obstacle that is still at large? The resolution or change over time element is missing. And there was a suggestion by Lena saying maybe you can leave it with an open ending and provoke a reflection in the reader or listener.
Yes, this is a great question. I love this question. So let me return to the climate change example. So climate change, no resolution here, ongoing conflict, ongoing obstacle, etc. What you can do is identify a specific aspect of the conflict or the obstacle, a smaller one. And in this case, let's say, because of climate change, um, the polar ice caps are melting, right? That's one consequence. And let's say that in the Arctic Ocean, there's a small group, somewhere along the way, there's a small group of fishermen and scientists who are working, and what they're trying to do is they're trying to save the baby seals. And what they do is they petition the government to to take some particular action or enact some kind of policy, and at the same time they themselves start rescuing the baby seals and creating a way for a safe space for these seals. And as a result, the seals are saved. They grow into, from babies into adults, and we have a resolution over there. The problem of climate change is not resolved whatsoever, but we have a specific obstacle within the larger story that can be perhaps resolved. Now, let's say in this particular case, the government enacts the policies, the fishermen save the baby seals, but one of them dies, or they find that this is not a long-term solution. That is also fine. Not every story has to have a neat resolution. Like Lena suggested, it can be open-ended, or you can use the result or the outcome to illustrate that it's not a perfect situation, and therefore you can embed what happens in many stories, yet another conflict or a reminder of the conflict you started with, to show that the story is not ended and people need to join in or take action. Um, we we may have another webinar where we'll talk about the structure of a story in much more detail and how you can kind of avoid some of these problems, or how you can use stories to inspire action from the audience. And we can talk about it in more detail, but this is one way you can start. I see there's some other questions.
Yeah, Lena is asking, apart from having an engaging story with a great start, etc., how do I get people to listen to my story, to actually stop and listen to it?
Yeah, great question. Love this question. One of the most interesting things, so you need a great start, you need an engaging character, a compelling character. You need an element of surprise. This is one of the most compelling ways you can get people to actually stop and listen. If it's a traditional setup with something that people are expecting, they already know the outcome of the story. So having some kind of surprising, either the character is surprising in some way, the context is surprising in some way, the way you tell it is surprising. There are many different things. And I think Lena is pointing to a bigger question, which is, how do you share your stories? How do you get people to actually listen to them or watch them? And that's like a whole other discussion. We need another webinar or a few hours of workshop to talk about how we distribute stories and get people to watch. But in terms of the structure of a story, it's really important to have some kind of element of surprise, to make it witty, to make it humorous, maybe to put a fresh spin on it in some way. So Lena says, especially when you share stories on Facebook and this is full of stories, how do I make it stand out? Yes, that's a big, big question. And we would need to have a lot more discussion about how to stand out in a crowd, how to make your story stand out in a crowd.
There's another thing related to the first element, what Pooja said. Ashi asks, I always look for some closure at the end of a story. An open ending for conflict stories sounds interesting, but when there's no closure at the end of a story, I often feel confused and sometimes even irritated. How can I tackle this if I was writing a conflict-based story?
Yeah, she's pointing to what many people feel when you have an open-ended story and they're like, what? I can't believe this happened. You took me this entire journey and now at the last second, there's nothing happened. There has been no change over time. It's one of the most frustrating things. And here, what I can suggest is if you're writing a story that you see no clear, first of all, every story, but if it's a big issue or something that's like the climate change issue that has no clear outcome, no clear resolution, within that you have to look for specific moments, one single event or a couple of events that have a beginning, middle, and end. And it doesn't mean that the end has to be neatly tied up with a bow, but you do need to have something happen by the end of that, some change. And by this, I think what I would encourage you to think is about some small type of change. We're not looking for huge, like suddenly everybody's singing kumbaya and there's world peace. Not happening, right? But we need to look at small change where, for instance, change in how a character feels, or their decision to change their behavior, or a change in how people view them, or small compelling change, whether it's positive or negative is fine. So for example, if you remember the story of the first person story, goes to the supermarket and finds that their wallet is missing and their phone. At the end of the story, what is their resolution? They were never going to go back to the store, which is not a positive change necessarily. It's kind of a negative attitude, but still it is a change in their thinking. And they say that they're going to also not put all their credit cards in that same wallet in one place. So you can have different types of change. And so actually, to answer your question, so can I direct the reader towards that change instead of just leaving an open end? Yeah, you can, absolutely. It really depends on what the story is trying to do and what it's trying to say. I think it's fine to have, so for example, if you're trying to inspire people to take action and you say, okay, the baby seals are still dying, we need you to take action to change this and petition the government, then you have a clear task or a call to action at the end of the story, which serves the purpose of a resolution, because then it's fine to leave it open-ended. So it really depends on what you're looking to do at the end of the story, what the outcome is that you're looking for. Okay, looking through these chats. The disappointing moment after a 700-page book. Yes, I know. I feel your pain. Any other questions or comments?
I suggest if you have like other questions are coming up later, you can send those questions to me, and then I can see if I can address them to Bix and get the answers later on, if this is okay for you, Bix.
Yeah, that sounds great.
Cool. Thank you so much for today's session. It was really, really great. I also learned a lot, and I guess everyone learned a lot about the different elements and aspects you need to take into consideration. So thanks so much. And
it's my pleasure, Yuli. Thank you.
Cool. So everyone is giving now their thank you on the chat. As I said, like this session has been recorded, so if you want to go back to the things and also go through the different videos Bix has shared with you beforehand, you can do this and watch them over and over again. And not sure, Bix, do you want to say some final words?
I just want to say that, I'm going to try and get a very short, like 2-minute survey out to you all just to see how, if we want to, one of the things with this webinar, the storytelling webinar, is we want to see if people are interested. We can offer more of them. And so it's just to gauge people's interest and value for this type of webinar. So I'm going to send a survey that Yuli will send on to you. And then also, we've been talking about maybe getting some project groups growing, people who are working on stories and how we can assist them. So hopefully that will happen in the next few months. But in any case, keep telling stories. And if you have questions, please send them to Yuli and she'll send them on to me. It was so great to do this with the Melton Foundation again.
Wonderful. Thank you, Bix. It was also really great for me to learn about all this. And thanks everyone for joining today, and talk to everyone soon. And now it would be great if everyone could unmute so that we can really hear that you are here, and give a big thank you and a big goodbye to Bix.
Thank you,
Thanks.
Bix.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, guys.
Thank you so much. It was great. It was great.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank
Bye.
you.
Thanks.
Thank you very much.
Bye.
Ciao, Yuli. Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye, Julie.
Bye, everyone.